Welcome to another episode of Highbrow Goodness, honeys. As some of our business headlines have shown over the last couple of years, art collectors are a part of public institutional history now, but were especially so in the early 20th century. The University of Groningen's Biography Institute says that they served as an important compass for shaping modern art's presence in museum systems across the world. But today, we're only going to focus on one of them. Helene Kröller-Müller is significant, as the London National Gallery writes, for being, quote, one of the first great women art patrons of the 20th century, unquote, because in the course of just over 30 years, she amassed a collection of over 11,500 objects, including artworks by neo-impressionist and modern art trailblazers, including Camille Pissarro, Georges Seurat, Pablo Picasso, and Piet Mondrian. So let's talk about her life and collection curation. It always seems the most logical to me when we're talking about a single person to take things chronologically, so we'll begin with her early life, the 1870s through 1890. She was born as Helene Emma Laura Juliane Müller on February 11th of 1869 in Essen, Germany, and was raised wealthy as her dad, Wilhelm Müller, owned a thriving company supplying raw materials to the mining and steel industries. Helene didn't have any real childhood connection to the arts, but was reportedly very smart and discovered Enlightenment ideas, especially philosophers like Spinoza, at the same time that she was beginning to question her own religious beliefs and religion itself in her early teens. Consequently, writes Daily Art magazine, quote, she formulated her life motto, Spiritus et materia unum, spirit and matter are one, end quote. In 1895, she attended a preparatory boarding school in Brussels where she got into literature by German Sturm and Drang writers as well as their predecessors, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art says that her desire to attend university went unfulfilled due to her father's resistance. Then her father turns back around and requests that she marries one of his most promising Dutch employees named Anton Kroller at age 19. The same year, in 1888, she moves with him to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Anton had been in charge of a branch of Müller & Co. there at the time, but when her father dies a year later, he becomes the director of the entire company. I know that sounds a little true crimey, but there was nothing to indicate any sort of foul play was ever suspected. Nevertheless, Müller & Co. soon operated on 4 continents. The success of it even allowed the Kröllers to become one of the richest and most influential families in the Netherlands once they moved there. The next 20 years are even more eventful for her. In 1895, Müller & Co. takes over the Nederlands Stoomboot Maatschappij, or the Dutch Steamship Company. That purchase increases the family's wealth and provides them with new travel opportunities. Anton subsequently moves the family and the company's headquarters to Hague that year as well. Meanwhile, the couple has 4 children before she turns 30, though it's unclear exactly what years they're born in. There's Helene Jr., Toon, Wim, and Bob. But in 1905, Helene Sr. is finally able to dedicate her downtime to developing her growing interest in the arts. Kroller-Müller and her daughter begin taking art classes from local art educator Hank Bremer, who introduced her to modern art and taught her how to observe it with a technical eye. Now, before enrolling in his classes, Kroller-Müller had acquired primarily Persian rugs, antique furniture, ceramics, but her collecting tastes change entirely after developing this close working relationship with Bremer. All the same, our source Daily Arts magazine argues, quote, she started collecting art probably because she found a spirituality in it that she couldn't find in religion, end quote. One piece of evidence for that is that the first work she purchased was called It Comes From Afar by Paul Gabriel. That 1887 artwork is a peaceful view of a country stream heading straight away from us into the horizon. Moving towards the right, we see a raised path with a man walking away from us, as well as a fisherman sitting along the banks. Then furthest right are some flooded fields. Meanwhile, on the left, there is a train headed our way in the distance along the tracks and the power lines that are staked in regular intervals. The sky takes up the upper 2/3 of the piece and is reflected in the river. According to the Kroller-Müller Museum, and we'll definitely get to the formation of that later, quote, Gabriel is considered one of the Hague School painters. These artists were also called the Dutch Impressionists, unquote. And I can see that sort of neo-impressionism here in the sense of the loose brush strokes, the concern with natural effects. This piece very much reminds me of a Turner artwork in that incorporation of a train whose smoke is blending into the sky as a reflection of the modern age incoming, and that emphasis on linear perspective. So by 1907, Bremer had become something of a proto-art advisor, quote, hired as her personal advisor to, inner quote, assist her her in assembling an art collection, end quote, and visiting studios, galleries, and auction houses on Kroller-Müller's behalf to help her source new work over the next few years, end quote. As Bremer is a recurring character in her story, we'll take a second to talk about who exactly he is. Forbes describes Hendrikus Petrus Bremer, aka Hank, who lived 1871 through 1956, as a, quote, mediocre painter who had discovered a lucrative sideline as an art evangelist to the dowagers of Rotterdam and The Hague, end quote, and writes, quote, Bremer had a grand theory of European painting. He contended it was one long struggle to loosen the shackles of realism and achieve pure exalted feeling, and he believed Van Gogh's work represented the most advanced stage of this evolution, end quote. It's important to note that many similar private modern art collections develop around Bremer, but hers develops into the largest and most important of them all, and their art nerd connection was really deep. According to the Kroller-Müller Museum, quote, later Helene would write about him, inner quote, he was my first minister and beside him I felt like a queen, end all quotes. But circling back to the shift in Kroller-Müller's buying patterns, pre-1920s, she focuses mainly on French and Dutch art. For example, in 1908, she purchases Van Gogh's Edge of a Wood and Four Sunflowers Gone to Feed, then two more, titled The Sower and Basket of Lemons and Bottle, the following year. And now the quickest possible overview I can give of each one of those. Edge of a Wood from 1883 is significant art historically because it's one of the first done with his brand new field easel, resulting in the higher vantage point we see here. Though honestly, it doesn't look like much to me. It uses a very dull natural palette, atypical for Van Gogh, and features a path winding perpendicular to the viewer's perspective through the trees, making me think we're maybe on a public park trail. As for Four Sunflowers Gone to Seed from 1887, this is an atypical arrangement and an atypical lack of background for Van Gogh, and an atypical stage of flower life too. Though the sunflowers are life-size and fill the canvas, they are made of warm and cold contrasting tones and are thought of by our sources as, quote, one of the high points of his Parisian period, end quote. We then have The Sower from June of 1888. The Van Gogh Museum points out that sowers, aka field hands, were a common subject for the artist. Quote, Van Gogh had a special interest in sowers throughout his artistic career. All in all, he made more than 30 drawings and paintings on this theme, end quote, says the Kroller-Müller Museum. This one in particular is notable because it was modeled after Jean-François Millet's The Sower from 1850. Van Gogh deeply admired that artist and made dozens of drawings using his as an example, quote, but in Arles he wants to paint a new, quote-unquote, modern version with radiant colors and sharp contrasts, end quote, resulting in the June 1888 artwork. In it, we see a yellow sky with a setting sun and a golden growing field taking up the upper fifth of the artwork. The rest is this sowed or cut field in blues and muted oranges, with the sower scene walking off towards our right. The focus of this piece really seems to be on the amount of work the sower has completed that day, on the heaviness of the earth and the sunset marking his change of activity. That reference to daily routines, plus the remaining crops in the distance there, could hint that this painting is about circles of life. And finally, we have Basket of Lemons and Bottle from 1888. This one is one of Van Gogh's earlier attempts to meet his aim of creating a work of art entirely in shades of yellow, but which falls a little bit short in some ways. Quote, in this still life, he is clearly still hesitant to work with yellow on yellow. This is apparent, for example, from the harsh tonal difference between the yellow of the lemons and that of the table, end quote, say our sources. He has some success increasing the contrast, though, through the inclusion of other greens and light blue shadows instead. But Kroller-Müller thought that this matched a verbal, sense-based description of lemons exactly and proudly purchased it. At the same time, however, in 1906, Kroller-Müller's daughter and her classmates set up the hockey club Otis, ODIS, together, and she meets Sam Van Deventer, who sends a letter to Anton asking about applying to work at Müller & Co. after graduation. Quote, in Anton's absence, Helene sends a comprehensive answer about the opportunities at the company. In 1908, Sam is hired as the youngest clerk, end quote. Kroller-Müller and Van Deventer develop a unique, deep, and platonic, mostly, love through their letters, which do sometimes show that lingering attraction and longing as well, which lasted from 1908 until her death. What's sort of incredible is that, according to our sources, even though that relationship with Van Deventer ruined Kroller-Müller's relationship with her daughter, it did not ruin the one with her husband. Quote, Anton Kroller trusted his wife. Eventually, they formed a strange trio, end quote. And the next 2 decades see even more development of her curate curational and collecting practices. On a trip to Florence in June of 1910, Kroller-Müller first begins toying with the idea of creating a museum house, but as we know now, it would take 25 years to realize that dream. But this wasn't an entirely innocent dream. According to Forbes, she wrote, quote, "In 100 years' time, it will be proof of the extent to which a merchant family at the turn of the century could achieve intrinsic refinement," end quote. Alongside the somewhat inspirational, aspirational messaging in that sentiment, we detect a bit of family pride and ego as well. Helene then hires the German modernist architect Peter Behrens to design a museum house on their Ellenwood estate outside The Hague, and when he flops, they ask Behrens' assistant, Mies van der Rohe, to give it a go, but decide ultimately to sell the estate in 1912 because of rumors of construction of a train line nearby, which, as you can imagine, would have been a total ambiance ruiner. Throughout the 1910s, Kroller-Müller also continues to grow more enamored with the Dutch artist Van Gogh, so much so that she went on a, quote, hunt for all the best Van Goghs, end quote, with Bremer in Paris in 1912. And another one of her own written documents that's quoted by our sources provides insight into why she loved him so very much. Quote, that he painted with stipples or pointillist strokes, that he employed contours and filled large areas with mixed or unmixed colors is beside the point. His value lies not in his means of expression, his technique, but rather in his great and novel humanity, end quote. The collecting dynamic duo spotted and nabbed Van Gogh's La Berceuse portrait of Madame Roulin at Gallery Bernheim June and bought 7 other works by Van Gogh before the day's end. The next, they purchased an early Signac and an early Seurat. Kroller-Müller would later describe this 1889 portrait of Augustine Rollin as, quote, the woman that the French sailor dreams of while sitting at the bow of his ship in the evening or at night, whom he entrusts with all his secrets. Van Gogh painted her not as a sea nymph, but as an old woman he knows, who holds the cord to rock the cradle in her hand, who makes him think that she is rocking the ship back and forth while he confesses his inner motives to her. And yet, she understands, has understood all those who speak to her. You can feel that from the depth of her inner life, which reveals itself to us in an exceptional calm, end quote. And so, from what our sources tell us, it makes total sense that she loved that piece because, quote, for her, the greatness of Van Gogh is in, inner quote, the calm with which he faced the complexity of things, end all quotes. She purchases another 15 paintings at the auction of the Hugendiek collection in Amsterdam, including work by Jean-Baptiste Corot, Jan Torup, Odilon Redon, and Honoré Daumier, as well as another 4 paintings by Van Gogh not long after that point. Crucially, though, she almost immediately starts contributing to the growth of Van Gogh's legacy by presenting and lending his works for groundbreaking shows. Our sources report that with 25 paintings and 13 drawings lent to the 125 artwork Sonderburn exhibition of 1912, she was the biggest lender. That exhibition is important, honeys, because it was the first major Van Gogh presentation in Germany and jump-started the interest in and appreciation of his artwork. But even while they're at that exhibition, the collecting never stops. The trio of Bremer, Anton, and Helene purchases 2 more paintings by Van Gogh from the collection of none other than Johanna van Gogh Bonger, aka the Indomitable, the OG legacy maker, whose life story we covered in Season 2, Episode 41. And the couple decides to go ahead and spend an extra day, just them two, at the exhibition and acquire a painting by Auguste Herbin called Roses and a cast stone sculpture by Wilhelm Lumbruck called Standing Female Figure. Anton also secretly purchases 2 separate paintings as a gift for Helene on the occasion of their 25th wedding anniversary. As far as those 2 pieces go, however, Roses is very cubist. It's got a Lempica sort of feeling. It's just a cluster of red and white roses in an orange vase on a tabletop. Relatively plain background here, despite some indication of shadowing through the color block choices. And Standing Female Figure, it's exactly that. It's a very classical looking statue of a woman standing with her weight rolled back onto her left hip, her right knee popped. But I realize the honeys may be wondering right about now about Anton and how he felt about or fit into all this art collecting. And he was not just along for the ride, even though the couple traveled together quite a bit. They both patronized and regularly visited auctions and galleries with Bremer. They bought from trusted dealers in Paris, such as Leonce Rosenberg. And even though Anton initially leans towards 17th century painting with the influence of his wife Anne Bremer, he also develops an eye for modern art. Anton never becomes quite as interested in Van Gogh as those two, but what he really enjoys is the speculative considerations of betting on the art market, essentially, of collecting. He's got a very beat the Johnsons desire to be ahead of everyone else. But refocusing on our main character here, by 1913, say our sources, Helene had already established a private museum in her name in The Hague, the first dedicated to modern art in the entirety of the Netherlands, with parts of the collection open to the public. For an explanatory overview of how this private museum connected to the ideas guiding her collecting practice, we can borrow from Hyperallergic, who in turn is citing the London National Gallery. Quote, "The aims this remarkable collector hoped to realize shared Neo-Impressionism's socialist ambition. By widening access to works made through a radical quest for harmony in art, the world might become a better place," end quote. But some caveats in play here did lead to a bit of misalignment. Although Museum Kroller was free to visit, visitors had to request a ticket in writing in advance. Maybe as a result, the majority of his visitors were wealthy bourgeoisie, students of Bremer, but also some other artists and art academy students. And shocking no one, Kroller-Müller gave Van Gogh the spacious front room of her museum that year as a statement in support of a then overlooked artist. She also became a frequent lender to various arts exhibitions in and outside of the Netherlands. Two somewhat major things happen in 1914. First, she decides to go to Liège, where she took care of wounded soldiers together with nuns and nurses at the Hôpital des Anglais. The events of World War I had stirred a really strong need to help in her. She wrote to Van Deventer, quote, "You see, Sam, I can't sit still and live in a country where war is waged only with pen and tongue in a sneaky way, while I hear and feel the world stirring abroad. Nor can I sit around doing nothing while my people fight and suffer," end quote. The war was a bit of a double-edged sword for her, though, because it meant profits for Müller and Company as well, so her ability to buy artwork, aka collect, as the war dragged on, continued to grow with it. Also in 1914, prominent De Stijl designer Bart van der Lek joined the buildings department of Müller & Co. He designs, among many other things, the monumental stained glass window titled Mijnbouw, or mining industry, for the entrance hall of the company's headquarters, and provides color advice for their residencies, designs the typography for Helene's collection folders even, with reproductions of the artworks in it. As for that window artwork, it is a 3x5 set of geometric images, each portraying some part of the mining, refining, shaping, or construction building with processes of ore and ironworking. Some of these frames contain no people at all, just rocks or buildings. Others have human figures who are all faceless and white. The fact of their whiteness is only a bit baffling because Van der Lek had visited the iron ore mines that operated in Spain and Algeria to get inspiration at the company's expense, so you would think there would be a little more diversity reflected there. Anyways, he produces many drawings, lots of sketches during his 4-month journey, and writes back to Bremer, quote, "The mine is interesting, fine to develop in my work. I have never seen so much color in the landscape as here. It is often enchanting," end quote. Van der Lek also almost becomes a part of Kroller-Müller's pioneering of the white cube modern art gallery aesthetic, which she first considered with him for the art room in her new villa in 1916. That plan was eventually abandoned as quote-unquote too radical, but the style would later be adopted in today's Kroller-Müller Museum. 1915 is a comparatively dull year. The Krollers acquire Villa Groot Hazebroek in Wassenaar, a more modern and austere home than their one just passed. She also commissions Joseph Mendes da Costa to make a statue of the South African general Christian de Wet because she very deeply respects her countrymen who had fought in the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902. She thinks that he's the greatest sculptor of their time and also asks the artist to make a monument for Martinus Stein, another Boer leader and a close acquaintance of the Krollers. Both of those commissions are placed in public park locations, making them her first public art commissions. Now, the final product of that de Wet monument is a big round base that looks like the top of a tank with a cornice-like relief along the uppermost edge, a short girthy column with an inscription of some sort that I was not able to read, and topping it all is a statue of the general in a dress suit holding one hand over his heart and staring into the distance. In other words, I would not know who that is supposed to be without being the researcher. It seems pretty realistic, but not very emotionally compelling. 1916 and 17 are a bit more eventful, however. When his color advice is rejected by newcomer to the project, Hendrik Petrus Berlage in 1916, Van der Lek terminates his contract over failure to negotiate more artistic freedom. So instead, Helene commissions Berlage to design a great museum on the Veluwe for her collection after liking the work he did on her 1915 country residence. She reportedly also, quote, liked the idea that something majestic didn't have to be built by the aristocracy but by a merchant. Unfortunately, in 1919, Berlage resigned after finishing the lodge building. Afterward, Helene Kröller-Müller asked the Flemish architect Henry van de Velde to build the museum, end quote. And the following year, in 1917, that is, she publishes the first official painting catalog containing an alphabetical overview of her collection, which at that point consists of 408 works provided by Bremer. In 1921, she reaches a major point in the realization of her dreams. The foundations for her museum are laid, but the bankruptcy of Muller and Company and the subsequent financial crisis of the 20s stopped her plans before they ever really got started. The Kroller-Müller Museum writes, quote, under Anton's direction, the company accumulates massive debts in a short period and thus experiences serious financial difficulties. In 1922, he's forced to halt the construction of the museum, and Helene informs Bremer that no more works of art can be purchased, end quote. Around this time, she writes to Sam, quote, when I pass the site of the museum now, it feels like an open grave that awaits its corpse. Sometimes I still cannot believe it, that it will not happen there. I am still waiting as if for a miracle, end quote. For the next few years then, Helene works instead with Henry van de Velde on the development of a so-called museum park near the Franzberg. She has the old path structure extended and rhododendrons planted, and she also installs some statues there. A fairly decent distraction as far as distractions go, but she refuses to give up during the build-back of the 1920s. Helene Kröller-Müller pivots again and organizes in 1923 a series of lectures for the Volksuniversität Den Haag in the exhibition spaces at Lange Voorhout, during which she examines the development in art from realism to abstraction since about 1850, primarily on the basis of her own collection. The lectures have a few different impacts on her collecting journey, the first of which is that it drives her to supplement her collection of old masters at about this time to increase the effectiveness and the resources for said lectures. She acquires a large work titled Venus with Cupid, the Honey Thief by Lucas Cranach the Elder and Portrait of a Man by Jacopo Robusti Tintoretto to show the distinctions between, the alterations between realism and idealism as something of a more consistent, a more long-standing conversation in art history. The Cranach the Elder work is largely focused on a very pale, long-limbed, and delicate-faced Venus whose gossamer veil is barely even visible. It, quote, serves more to emphasize her nudity than preserve her dignity. This kind of depiction of the female nude by Cranach was already very popular in his day, end quote. But the narrative here seems to be Cupid's mother, Venus, teaching him that the wounds of love caused by his arrows are just as painful as the bee stings he's experiencing as a result of him stealing honeycombs. The Latin text in the top left corner compares the pain from the sting to that of heartbreak. And a fascinating side note from our sources here, although the painting is technically undated, we know it was definitely made after 1537 because that was the year that Cranach started depicting the dragon motif seen in the family crest above Cupid and also his signature with lowered wings. As for the Tintoretto work, the Venetian artist still painted in the style of his famous tutor Titian at the start of his career, and we can see that influence here. He depicts the figure against an even, dark background with only the face and hands highlighted and given any detail, while in later works we see these vibrant, colorful scenes from the Bible and history. The focus of this Tintoretto piece is directed to the face of the man and the fur trims of his robe. This seems to hint at his importance or maybe his humanity. But back to the story at hand, these lectures turn out to be so successful she transcribes them for publication in her 1925 book, Considerations Regarding Problems in the Development of Modern Painting. In it, she proposes two dominant strands of modern art, realism and idealism, based on her own interest in the impacts of neo-impressionists like Van Gogh on the artistic developments of her day. And in some ways, it seems that she was right. The London National Gallery writes that the technique of pointillism, quote, simplified form and played with color in an entirely new way, verging on the edge of abstraction. Alongside this exciting approach to color, their style went hand in hand with radical political ideas. They captured late 19th century European society through luminous landscapes, portraits, and interior scenes, while also depicting the struggles faced by the working class in reaction against the industrial age, end quote. Struggles like those of Van Gogh's sewers, Seurat's Parisian courtesans, Diego Rivera's townspeople, so on. In 1927, our girl boss makes another strategic move. She responds yes to a request to loan 140 drawings and paintings from her collection collection, again mostly Van Goghs, for inclusion in a large retrospective that's shown in 3 Bs, Basel, Bern, and Brussels. The exhibition ends up attracting 30,000 visitors in Brussels alone. At home, meanwhile, she organizes solo exhibitions in her museum at Lange-Voorhout with artists Bart van der Lek, Odilon Redon, and on the occasion of his death, Jan Toeroep. She also presents a couple double exhibitions, aka ones featuring 2 artists. She then concludes that series with a major retrospective for Van Gogh in April, in which her 98 paintings, 24 aquarelles, and 135 drawings by the artist are shown to visitors from around the world. And the next year then, Anton and Helene create the Kroller-Müller Foundation to protect the art collection and estate from any issues with Müller & Co., their family business. They also decide the future museum will be housed on more than 75 acres of their formerly private estate in Otterlo, which is now known as the Hoge Veluwe National Park. The 1930s, especially 1931, bring with them tough times for the company. Yet again, the art advising contract with Bremer this time is terminated for good, and when the offices of Müller & Co. at Lange-Voorhout are also forced to close in 1933, the art collection of Kroller-Müller is transferred to a villa in Wassenaar. But Kroller-Müller is still determined. In 1934, she calls the Minister of Art, Education, and Science at the time, Henri Marchant, and succeeds in convincing him to get help from the Dutch state for museum construction by showing him around the collection and talking over the benefits of displaying it publicly. So, after reaching an agreement with the Dutch national government in 1935 to construct a museum at Hoge Veluwe and to retain Belgian designer and architect Henry van de Velde, the Müllers promised to donate their entire collection, which eventually totaled about 12,000 objects, to the state in the near future on the sole condition that the museum be built in the gardens of their park. So their estate, their private property, becomes the property of their foundation, with a mortgage loan from the state, and the hunting lodge at St. Hubertus is also sold with the land purchase, though the Krollers are permitted to live there until their death. So they no longer own any of it, but they are still allowed to occupy part of it. Among a couple other factors, however, the Depression had caused a drastic scaling back and delay of plans even as this agreement was worked towards. Another issue is that Marchant's successor, Jan Rudolf Slotemaker de Bruin, did not feel responsible for his predecessor's legacy and decided that the state would only contribute 10,000 guilders per year to the operation of the museum, making the construction of a palatial format seem out of the question. So instead, a quote-unquote temporary brick building goes up in 1935, with its construction becoming a public works project for the unemployed, who erected the single-story pavilion in just 14 months. By this point, say our sources, Helene was in her late 60s, yet she visited the construction site daily to supervise the work, strictly supervising the arrangement of the artworks in the rooms within this transitional museum in the later stages from a wheelchair, and was assisted by Willie Alping Jr., which makes him technically the first curator of the Kroller-Müller Museum. At the same time, though, Müller & Company is reorganized under pressures from its shareholders. Anton remains involved as a commissioner from 1934 onwards, but loses his director position. Without Anton's protection, however, Sam van Deventer is sacked in 1937, so Müller & Company is no longer a family business at that point. But in 1937, she puts up one final show for public viewing of her collection at her current home. After 3 months, the entire thing is transported to Hoenderloo in a series of once-a-day police-escorted trips to spread the risk out, of course, where it is temporarily stored in St. Hubertus, as well as the upcoming museum's service building, while staff begin transitioning to their new home. The Kroller-Müller Museum is then officially opened by Minister Slotemaker de Bruin on July 13th of 1938, with Helene herself inaugurating the quote-unquote temporary building, still in use today, and becoming the museum's first director. And after becoming widowed sometime in the late 30s, she inherits the fortunes from the former family business and becomes one of the wealthiest women in the Netherlands. Finally, after a lifetime of waiting and planning and pivoting, her dream is realized. And she never has to worry about living uncomfortably. But in late 1939, Helene Kröller-Müller becomes sick and later passes away on December 14th, surrounded by her loved ones. After her body was laid next to her beloved art in her museum for a few hours, she was buried, and Forbes says that she had stipulated the collection remain exactly as she left it before her death. Her headstone reads, quote, "I believe in the perfection of all things." things, end quote. Which brings us to the legacy section of this incredible woman's life. Ultimately, her goal was to create a collection, quote, for the benefit and enjoyment of the community, end quote. And that collection has been described by our sources as, quote, gutsy, given the fact that it was formed at a time when the Netherlands had no museums devoted to contemporary art. Few people in Holland were buying Picasso or Cézanne in the first decades of the 20th century, let alone Mondrian's color-coded grids, which Helene considered the final glorious leap in the development of painting, end quote. Says current Kroller-Müller museum director Van Straten, quote, she was way ahead of the social environment of her time. She was already collecting with the didactic idea to convince the public that contemporary art was worth looking at, end quote. But despite these humanist, these somewhat progressive goals, she did have her preferences, mostly avoiding the Fauvists and German expressionists. Quote, later movements such as Dada and Bauhaus are also too unfamiliar to her. She discovers futurism too late to be able to make important acquisitions, end quote. But the Met confirms that works in her collection do include canvases by, of course, Cranach the Elder and Vincent Van Gogh, but also Georges Seurat, Albert Gleizes, Juan Gris, Gino Severini, Leopold Sauvage, and Diego Rivera, among others. And of course, as ArtNet writes, she is, quote, best known as one of the very first collectors to recognize the significance of Vincent Van Gogh's unusual painting style, end quote. She amassed, actually, the largest private Van Gogh collection in the world at no fewer than 91 paintings and 180 works on paper. Another French painter, Henri Edmond Cross, is one of the best represented artists in Kroller-Müller's collection after Van Gogh and Seurat. She especially adored his abstracted landscapes, which, in the collector's words, capture a sense of, quote, the unchanging, pure reality behind the changeable forms of nature, end quote. And the artist of the very last neo-impressionist artwork ever acquired by Kroller-Müller, called In July Before Noon, a summary pointillist composition featuring 5 women at rest from 1890, was another key member of the group known as the 20, which played a prominent role in developing neo-impressionism. That painter's name is Theo van Rijsselberg. The Kroller-Müller Museum today is encircled by a later added sculpture garden, one of the largest in Europe, at over 160 sculptures by iconic artists from Jean Dubuffet to Martepan to Pierre Hugues, distributed throughout. This is because, according to our sources, quote, the museum in 1947 chose as director the ambitious art critic A.M. Hammacher. He had no intention of caretaking a mausoleum, end quote, so the Kroller Museum has commissioned every year since 1 new sculpture on average. But it's getting harder for the museum to stick to that schedule as the Dutch government has cut back on funding and corporate sponsors are few and far between in this obscure corner of Holland. In any case, our sources say, quote, in its own modest way, the sculpture garden is a wonderful antidote to the painting collection's self-importance, end quote. And to round out our legacy section here, I'll leave you with questions raised by reviews of a recent show titled Radical Harmony, Helene Kröller-Müller's Neo-Impressionists, which took place at the National Gallery of London, and these reviews point out her privilege as a wealthy woman with earlier access to artists than most. Most of the critiques admittedly came from our regular source, Hyperallergic, whose exhibition review was titled, quote, a neo-impressionism show for the 1%, and who found the show lacking in self-awareness and in ingenuity. Even though we have seen some other reviews celebrating and emphasizing the politically radical, aka quote-unquote socialistic iconographic content included, such as Jan Toorup's depiction of workers in Evening Before the Strike and Morning After the Strike of 1899 through 90, Hyperallergic suggests that, quote, the whole show feels more about commerce than curation, end quote, maybe because it is, quote, perpetuated by commercial supporters such as the philanthropic venture Griffin Catalyst, end quote. What the reviewer for Hyperallergic seems to take the most issue with here is the couple's lack of reflection on their own position in life. They point out that the wall text for Maximilian Luce's rendering of workers in the Iron Foundry of 1899 notes that Kroller-Müller's husband bought it direct from the artist and, quote, without any apparent sense of irony, end quote, hung it in the office of his iron ore and shipping business. Author Olivia McEwen writes, quote, this absurdity infuses the whole show, which exists because a wealthy benefactor unironically chomped up all examples of an art movement that on paper represents socialist politics, but is, in itself, technically prescriptive and stifling of deviation, end quote. Though there is a little potential in the form of personal preference here, McEwen really seems not to be impressed by neo-impressionism or pointillism on the whole. She writes, quote, while radical in theory, images are confined to flat linearity linearity, almost like coloring in sections, as opposed to building up painterly layers as traditional modeling allows, end quote, resulting for her in mainly flat images and not in a good way. Now, I didn't bring up that review as a way to bum you out at the end of the episode, but I think it's important to recognize, as that article does, the good and bad of some of these art historical figures as legacies, especially given that Helene Kröller-Müller's impact on the public is so large and continues to this day. I also think it's important to really consider the problem that McEwen brings up here of those who can afford it buying up all the examples of a new emerging art movement while it's trendy, while it's hot, and then potentially letting those items sit far from the public view, even private view. Do we see any parallels between Kroller-Müller's buying patterns in the early 20th century and the buying patterns of certain people today? What does it mean to have access be determined by money, and especially by the benevolence of those who have money and therefore have resources like art? How do the relations and agreements between private entities and state or federal governments play into the access that the public is allowed to have? What are the intricacies of those dynamics? Those are all questions that come up in this story, and questions that I hope you will continue to think about even after I leave you today. A quick reminder before we go that we have businesses, new Substack articles, and more, including a spooky special headed your way. So be sure to tune in for all of that. But in the meantime, hydrate or dihydrate and take care. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugno. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.